This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is poet and scholar Camille Dungy. Camille has documented how she diversified her garden to reflect her heritage in her book, Soil, The Story of a Black Mother's Garden. We talk about the politics of gardening, planting a nature garden, and how nature writing has influenced our gardens in the past, and how it can shape the way we garden in the future. I begin by asking Camille what her latest book is about, and what prompted her to write it.
So the book follows 7 years of my family's efforts to diversify the landscape around us from the ground up. So we are working on creating a more native garden, a big patch of it we call the Prairie Project, that's primarily native and non-aggressive naturalized plants and low water and good for our northern Colorado climate. So that's a big part of the book, is just that sort of the practical elements of what it means to take a very homogeneous landscaping plan and shift it into a more rewilded, native, supporting environment. It happens that my family is one of very few Black families in this community. And so another piece of the questions in the book are around cultural diversity, racial diversity, and the ways that we build more supportive, sustainable environments around us as people.
And that's one of the things that struck me when I read the book, which from the start was that you did state, obviously you're different to the, I think, overwhelming majority of your area in terms of race. And your garden, I think, is also quite different. I know the rewilding movement is gaining traction, as is the native plant movement, but your garden is presumably a little bit different to a lot of the yards that would have been in your area. And did you worry about that statement that you were making with the garden?
I'm not sure I would use the word worry, but I was aware of the fact that we were doing something very different than a lot of the yards around us. And we looked different. We were different looking people doing different work. And in the US, there is an intersection between homogeneity in terms of what your yard and house is supposed to look like, and who is supposed to be in certain communities. And so this homogeneity has been enforced legally through homeowners associations, through fines, through covenants, through loan practices, all kinds of things that make the seemingly not particularly dramatic statement of I'm going to have my yard not fit covenant and code. Something's real is at stake there, because as a Black family in one of these communities, I run a different kind of risk of not being seen as welcome if I make really different aesthetic decisions. As it turns out, this community where I live has been embracing of these decisions that I've made. And in fact, on the citywide scale, there are all kinds of incentives for people to create lower water native gardens. And our state has a ballot measure coming out that would make it illegal for homeowners associations to prevent people from doing this kind of work in their yards. So as it happens, I have done this in an essentially welcoming environment, but that is not the case for everybody who makes these kinds of decisions.
Here in the UK, it's gaining traction, as I said, but it's still a statement to make if you are letting your garden look different to what is perceived to be traditionally a garden.
Mm-hmm.
I think you place a lot of emphasis on pollinators. So what was the importance for you in terms of catering for them?
Well, we are dependent on those little critters, right? I mean, like all of us are dependent on healthy pollinator populations. And it's not just European honeybees we need to be dependent on. We need to be dependent on a really wide variety of species. And those species are dependent on human decisions and for what goes in gardens, for how much space between supporting plant systems. So I just often feel like major change can begin with me. No major change can happen without small changes, and I can be part of the small changes that can help major changes happen. And so I just am delighted when I am out now in the garden and see such an incredible variety of species of pollinators and other kinds of animals, birds also, that I didn't see when I first moved into this house and that I don't see in a lot of other places. It's a delight for me to see vibrant life around me.
I like that because I do think that, as you say, the change starts small. And you wrote in the book, actually, that every politically engaged person should have a garden. So do you feel that the onus really is on the individual to start making these changes?
Well, I think that we can think micro and macro on that. There has to be kind of sweeping institutional, government-wide, industry-wide changes. Like my little tiny yard is not going to make the kind of difference that agriculture farming practice shifts would make, right? And still, I can do the things that I can do, right? And so I can decide not to use certain kinds of biocides, which means more work on my part in terms of keeping a kind of balance of pests and watching out for invasive weeds and things like that. But the benefit for me is worth the work to not kind of have a scorched earth policy, to have gotten rid of pests and things. So yes, I do believe that I can make a difference. And I also believe that by modeling a certain kind of yard and helping people see how this other kind of landscaping practice can be really beautiful and exciting and inviting, then the next person might feel less afraid to do it. And that is another way that my small individual action can become a communal, larger action.
It's interesting that you mentioned the work involved in your garden. I think a lot of people feel that gardens that are wild and built for nature don't involve work, but I think that's probably not the case. Have you found that?
It's certainly not the case for me. I find that I do spend a good bit of time out there doing maintenance work. I don't know that my garden would be officially a rewilded landscape, because I do kind of come in and do like trimming and cleaning and things like that, which is necessary to do because we've removed a lot of forces that would have been doing that work in the wild, and we've replaced or put into these spaces other forces that are working against the kind of native habitat. And so I do need to come in and do some maintenance work, because I don't know, whatever the northern Colorado equivalent to a wild boar would be. I don't have that kind of digging, rooting creature in my garden. So sometimes I have to do the work that a wild boar might do to open up the space, et cetera, right? And so I think that is part of the way that work happens. I have bindweed all over the yard, and it's really deleterious to a lot of the other plants. So I spend a lot of time picking bindweed, which about once a year, somebody is like, just spray it with Roundup and then it'll be gone. And just that's against everything that I've been working on in the garden. And so there I am many hours every summer trying to kind of keep the bindweed manageable. I'm never going to be able to eliminate it, but I can keep it manageable. That's some of the work that has to happen to keep things going.
In the UK at the moment, there is a bit of a debate raging. We have our kind of traditional standards of horticulture and what people find aesthetically attractive. And then we have this more loose aesthetic that it finds beauty, or is trying to find beauty in a wilder garden that has multiple layers of meaning and significance for the people who use it. I suppose the debate centres around this concept of beauty. You know, should we be upholding this tradition of beauty in a garden, or can we explore a new aesthetic and get people to appreciate that and all the different things that are involved in a garden that's not just primped and preened and sprayed and controlled in every aspect? I mean, do you think it depends on reframing beauty in a garden? And I suppose from that, is it okay to express your individuality within a garden space?
This is one of the places where the social, cultural, and historical elements of my book come in as both metaphor and just plain fact, right? If the question on the table is whether one kind of beauty is the only kind of beauty with value, my answer is always going to be no. And I'm gonna tend to really, really challenge anybody who tries to tell me that there's only one way of being in the world that can be appreciated as valuable and beautiful. That's an incredibly dangerous, small-minded way of appreciating the vast varieties of possibilities for being in the world. And so as a Black person, as a mother, I write in the book a lot about how odd and also, I think, troubling it is that so many of the foundational environmental texts of the 19th and 20th century just erase people's families. People just don't have families. Well, families are messy. Families, a lot of the things that happen with families happen inside the house. And there's, this difference, supposed to be this big divide between the domestic and the wilderness and the outdoor space. But there's a bunch that's like wild and fascinating just in my backyard, right? And so I don't think you need to have that kind of separation. When I think about different histories, right? When people bring in different cultural histories into how to garden and what to garden and to what to grow, those then complicate how a garden might look. And I think that that's fascinating and interesting to have those kinds of possibilities showing up. So I think that one of the most important things about the environmental gardening movement needs to be an openness to variety and a willingness to experience different kinds of beauty, different presentations, different sorts of plants and animals showing up in our gardens.
I thought it was really interesting how you wrote about motherhood and, the time demands on you as a woman, as a caregiver. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm not a mother, but I do realise there are demands on my time that sometimes I find even the going out into the garden, almost there's maybe a sense of guilt attached to it. And gardening can be almost like a luxury thing to do with your time, particularly if you find it pleasurable. Can we make time for ourselves? Is there a way to make ourselves just that little bit more selfish, that we can find time and express our creativity as well in a garden space?
Well, if you're thinking about the garden, the way that I often think about gardening is that this is my little patch of an effort to save the world. Then maybe you're not being selfish, right? When you're in that space, because I'm making a space that is a welcoming space, not just for me, but for all of those beneficial pollinators that we're talking about, all those birds that come into that space, right? If I'm not leaning heavily on biocides and creating a very restrictive space that I don't allow other living beings into, then I'm not just looking out for myself when I'm taking care of a garden.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. One of the quotes that I took from the book and I wanted to ask you about is that you say, if I cultivate a flourishing, I want its reach to be wide. And I wondered what you meant by that. Is that about sharing the garden and the aesthetic of it?
Yeah, I think that that's a big part of it. I tell a little story about an artichoke plant that it went very quickly past the point of my being able to harvest it. And then it has this beautiful flower. The ants loved it. Bees love artichoke flowers. That very easily could have been something that I would just say that's a failure and I'm cutting it down or I'm spraying the ants, etc. But I left it because now those ants had a place to be and work to do that wasn't really bothering me. The flower, the artichoke flower is gorgeous. I can get an artichoke a different kind of way, right? Like I'm not dependent on that single plant to feed me and my family. And so I can create this space where all those other critters were able to get some sustenance from that artichoke plant, and I could look at its flower.
For me, that throws up an interesting question, and I am the same. And I've come around more to vegetable growing as I've got more into horticulture. And I always used to think, well, yeah, I can get potatoes or I can get carrots. I don't need mine to be perfect. But there's a little part of me that wonders if I do that, am I then putting the burden on someone else to manage that? You know, even if it's a farmer, or am I kind of then almost kicking the can down the road and making it somebody else's problem? I don't know. It's a tricky thing for me, that one.
That's fair. That is tricky. In the summer, we have a little farm stand nearby and I like supporting them, so in that sense, I feel like I'm creating a demand for a small farm stand supplier.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it, actually. Yeah. You've gardened for quite some time. Have you learned any lessons from gardening?
Oh, I'm learning lessons all the time. And then, I master that. So then that's fine. And then I go on and try a new thing. And then I'm like, ooh, gotta learn those lessons, So I think it really helps neuroplasticity, right? Because I get to keep trying new things and learning new things. And this year we've had so much rain. I don't remember having this much rain in May and June since the very first summer we lived here. And so plants are growing very differently. Things are really leggy, and things that are usually pretty short or really tall. And it's just, the thing about a garden, particularly a chemical-free garden like I'm growing, is going to be different every year because the conditions are different every year. And so even if I'd learned the lessons from last year in the mature parts of the garden, this year is a new year.
Yeah, it is a constant learning curve, and nothing is ever what you expect. You can enjoy a fantastic strawberry harvest one year, and then the following 4 years it'll be rubbish. So yeah, it's constant surprises. Moving, I suppose, to the wider picture, your sphere is nature writing, and gardens form a part of nature because I think of how they complement it and how they can support it, and for many other reasons. But I wondered if you could just kind of tell us a bit about your take on the state of modern nature writing. I know it's a big question and it's a big area, but how do you feel things are panning out in that at the moment?
Well, that is a big question. I think I actually am really excited by so much of very contemporary environmental writing, because I feel like the writing is so frequently much more expansive than I remember in the work I was raised reading. It's much more expansive in terms of who's writing and how they're writing. I find there's a lot of kindred spirits writing work that is not only questioning many of the practices of the 20th century, but giving guides for other ways of doing and being. Rewilding by Isabella Tree like pops to mind right away. The Hidden Life of Trees is another one that pops to my mind. Like, just different ways of thinking about the living world as an interconnected, living, exciting, dynamic force. And so that's fun. And then in the States, I love the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, Amy Nezuko-Matadel, Ross Gay, Pam Houston. These are all writers who I think write a kind of very integrated kind of ideology where life and the greater than human world and the human world are just deeply interconnected. This feels necessary to me because of just where we are on this brink of environmental collapse. All of our daily lives have to be directly engaged in maintaining and preserving and protecting this home we all share. And so these writers who don't feel the need to separate the inside of their minds and the kind of dailiness of their lives from conversations about the environment feel like the most savvy and useful of the writers.
I really feel as if the environmental writing is deeply influencing what happens in our gardens. Do you think that's always been the case?
I don't know that I think it's always been the case, because certainly in my training, I don't think that the garden was considered the provenance of nature writing. I think that in the US, at least, nature writing was about like being away from the house and like going on big, deep treks into the mountains and far, far away from the house. I think if you were talking about a garden, it was a very different kind of book. And so I think that now there may be more of a movement in that direction, but I don't think that that has always been the case.
I mean, I think that probably is a good thing for us right now.
Oh, it's necessary, because most of us don't have an opportunity to just go far, far out. And also, if you're saying like the only way that you can appreciate natural beauty is to leave home and like go on some distant trek by yourself, that really eliminates the opportunity for most people to be able to create a deeply felt connection with the greater than human world. So I think it's necessary that we bring this conversation much, much closer to home, as with the garden stories.
Thank you so much to Camille for taking the time to talk to me about her amazing book, which is already gaining a lot of fans across the gardening world here in the UK. Thank you to Jake Rayson and Antonia Malchik for highlighting some potential talking points with Camille. And thanks to you for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now, talking about a bug with an important role to play in the garden.
Within the animal kingdom, we find many examples of species that, often through folklore and misunderstanding of their lives, have become creatures of myths, legends, and even horror. And many of these will be from the bug world, where a few of those ancient beliefs are still reverberating today. Like fireflies being spirits of the dead, or the ceaseless bad luck that will result from killing a bee. And even some of the erroneous blatherings from medieval times, such as the daddy-long-legged spider being the most venomous creature on earth, or the earwigs crawl into our ears at night and burrow into our brains. But quite often, some of the common names that we use today for these creatures reflect the age-old fallacious beliefs of our ancestors, which no doubt help in preserving the myths and legends of the past. And this is certainly the case with a narrow rectangular-bodied, medium-sized beetle that's regularly seen throughout Britain each summer on the open structured flowers of daisies, cow parsley and hogweed. A bright, blood-red coloured beetle whose common name, the bloodsucker, has, I'm sure, terrified many young children over the years, which, many, many years ago, and thanks to a primary school teacher, included me. But fear not, the bloodsucker beetle is completely harmless to us. It doesn't sting, it doesn't bite, and it certainly doesn't feed on human blood. In fact, it's quite a placid beetle that has acquired a couple of other common names too. The red soldier beetle, because of its army redcoat colour, and rather amusingly, the bonking beetle, as it's rarely seen alone and spends most of its short life as an adult engaged in mating, even whilst they are gorging themselves on nectar. But when they've had enough of the mating, the females leave the flowers and search for somewhere safe within the soil to lay their eggs, whilst the males continue feeding on nectar and even start eating aphids before they die. Then within a week, the eggs hatch into tiny larvae that live and grow amongst the decaying wood and detritus on the ground, catching and eating ground-dwelling invertebrates such as slugs and snails for up to 3 years before they pupate, and then emerge as the next generation of bloodsuckers, red soldier beetles, or bonking beetles. But whatever we choose to call these amazing insects, we certainly need to cherish them as predatory creatures that, if we allow, can naturally keep some of the most notorious plant-eating bugs under control.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.